I would have been very quiet about my disagreement about this stuff if I wasn't concerned. Uh, if I wasn't absolutely like shit, like I'm scared, okay? Like, but for me, it's because I think that we are afraid of the wrong apocalypse. You know, if there are two apocalyptic horsemen fighting, and that would be the dark horse that is deflation, and that reaper. The person who mounts it, is the reaper of death himself, and on the other end is the runaway horse, the unstoppable force that is inflation. On the other end, and everything. And the truth of the matter is that there are forces inside our economy, like the creditors, who, because of the fact that under a capitalistic system like ours, a business will attract shareholders who will then push the company to grow no matter what. What capitalism does, inherently with banks, is it creates credit bubbles. And even within the mere days after a credit bubble blows up, the bankers will be right back to building up and inflating another bubble. You know, they certainly were after 2008. And the reason why it's this way is if you have money that's parked, in the if you're like a shareholder for somebody like Bank of America, then that company has a legalistic, and fiduciary responsibility to try to boost and maximize its profits for you. And so what happens is that these companies first, they start making loans on deposits to the people who are, let's say, should we say, fiscally well adjusted. After a while, you run out of people that are fiscally well adjusted, right? And then you have to start loosening lending standards and taking risks to lend to borrowers who are not so reliable, fiscally well adjusted, and as good of a risk as the people that were borrowers and everything inside the whole thing. And so eventually you start lending money to subprime borrowers because you have to do this. If you didn't do this, you'd be letting your shareholders down. And you've got a legal responsibility to try to maximize profits for them and everything. So, you're put into a bind. You have to take that risk. If you don't take that risk, then you're not, really, where else are you going to get the growth from inside the system? And so, like a bank, and even to some extent, the credit unions all engage in this, although they're prudent about avoiding, some of the more terrible risks because and your members won't push them to do this. When you see it for some of these companies that, like these banks that are traded, that if you got shares that are being traded on Wall Street, then your shareholders are going to push you, in order to do this, to eventually make subprime loans and everything, because there's nowhere else to go for any further growth in these companies. And so, the very business model of a bank lending money for, profit and everything, and to make loans, why its shares are being traded on Wall Street, creates a scenario where the banks are basically not legally allowed to learn from experience. They can't. They're not allowed to, because if they did learn from experience, they would be letting their shareholders down. And so it creates a situation where the banks are legally obligated to create credit bubbles for the very people that own the shares of the bank. you know and so that's why it happens over and over and over, and the same thing keeps happening over and over and over because this is one of the contradictions and obscenities of shareholder capitalism and what it creates because a company has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders to try to generate profits and to grow. And so it's got the ideology of a cancer cell where it demands infinite growth. And so as a result, you have a situation where have a bank that eventually runs out of fiscally well-adjusted individuals to lend money to. And then it starts underwriting bad loans. And when it starts underwriting bad loans that create, what happens is that, essentially it isn't a problem for the whole economy at first. But over time, as they keep making more and more and more and more and more subprime loans to risky borrowers, the risk keeps going up and up and up. And eventually you get a wave of defaults and you end up in a boom bust cycle, and everything. And the banks will always do this. They will always do this. So when the next crisis hits, expect that 5 days, not even after, they'll be inflating another bubble. You know, because the truth of the matter is that they have to do this because this is what shareholder capitalism produces. Welcome to, late stage capitalism and everything. We're gonna go through the same fucking shit we went through back in 2007. And then we're gonna go through it again after that, and we're gonna keep going through it in boom and bust cycle after cycle after cycle. That's the future and everything. And so that's why I'm concerned. I think that you're afraid of inflation, and I see that underneath the floorboards of that inflation, cracks are building in the forms of delinquencies, debt defaults, and all of this, and the deflationary shock risk that they create. And so, here on YouTube, most of what I'm hearing is about de-dollarization and all this other stuff. I'm not hearing that much about credit bubbles and what the bankers are doing, and how you know much of like the inflation that we've had. If you go to a shopping center and you see how prices have gone up, you're probably going to take that at face value. But I'm a little bit more of a you know, introspective individual, and I see these elevated price levels and I start asking questions. Why are prices up? And then, it hits me that I live in a country where there's all these credit cards. uh Visa and MasterCard don't give a shit because they're not the ones to, they're just a payment network. They're not the ones that are actually underwriting the loans on those cards, so they're just a payment network. That's all they are. These cards get let down all the time, and you've got all these people running around in the system and sloshing around in it. So it's like, how much of this new inflation is the people that went into debt to maintain the standard of living they had before COVID happened? How many of these individuals are in that situation at this point? How many in the system are and how much of this recent inflation is debt fueled, and everything, and what does that mean? What are the implications of that? And everything. And what I see is that no matter what category of debt we look at, delinquencies are going up. I also know that the financial crisis itself of 2017 hit after a wave of defaults, you know, in um in the housing market created, you know, after the wave of defaults, the price of homes crashed 30% and the stock market fell by 50%. And so, what happened to the dollar in scenarios like this after a while was, because so many of the loans went bad, right? As a result, the bankers, and the people that were underwriting loans at that point and writing them off or writing them, we went through a credit crunch after that, where the banks tightened the reins on, lending and everything. And when they tightened the reins, everybody still had debts to pay off. And so demand for the dollars skyrocketed. Everybody was chasing the few dollars that were liquid but were not being lent out in the system like crazy. They were willing to sell anything to you at fire sale to get it at that point, and everything. And so, your dollars that were in your pocket skyrocketed in value. And so my fear is that a lot of these people that you see are hedged out the ass about inflation. They've bought gold, they've bought silver. They did all this to store value and to basically, how should I put it? They did it to protect themselves and to hedge against inflation on account of the bailouts. But if this happens again and everything, when the dollar shoots up in value, you know what happens to the price of gold usually? It goes down. Same with silver and precious metals. Because they are essentially seen for what they are, which is a hedge against dollar depreciation. And so when the dollar, appreciates instead of depreciates, it tends to knock the price of gold and precious metals down and everything. And so their performance, get takes a hit in a scenario like that. And so that means that if I'm right and these credit bubbles have the effect of basically skyrocketing the value of the dollar, then these gold bugs and silver bugs and all these people that are hedged against inflation are going to be caught by the coming crisis with their pants around their ankles, totally and woefully unprepared for deflation. It's going to catch them totally off guard and they're going to get wiped out in the wave because they didn't see it coming. They didn't even think to be remotely afraid of it, because this country hasn't been through a deflationary crash, of like except for 2007 since 2007 was the last time that we went through a cycle of deflation. But before that, it broke back all the way to the Great Depression. For most of us and for most of our life, prices have only gone in one direction, up. And so the thought that they could ever come down and that gravity is there or that debt is the force that builds up that gravity is just something that you wouldn't even think about for the most part. Most people are going to be taken off guard by the storm that I think is coming. Most people will not. The storm that I think is coming is unthinkable to most of them.